Here we are on the trail with our lime green two-door 5.3 LT. Let's see, he's got PSC. This thing actually rides pretty good off-road for a two-door. Evo springs, well-done rock rails, Dynatrac axles, bunch of Evo stuff. It's a pretty nice Jeep. Let's take a quick look under the hood. So while this does look like an LT1, it is an LT 5.3. Got the Motec battery tray, PSC reservoir. There's our expansion tank, and that's an expansion tank, guys. So you do have to check the level of the water every once in a while. Other than that, this is a pretty typical build that runs really good. We are in a lime green two-door late model JK with an LT 5.3. I do believe this is an L82. This really is the engine that you need in your JK. It may not be the engine you want. You've heard me say that many times. And I'm going to make my argument for the LT 5.3. Now, the reality is you're not going to save a whole ton of money going to the 5.3 versus the 6.2. We are talking several $1,000s, but at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is what do you want and what do you need. So let's start off by saying that the LT 5.3 is no slouch. The engine I'm driving now is rated up to 380 horsepower, and it's very deceiving. If you got in this vehicle and drove it, and then you got out and drove, let's say, a 5.7 VVT Hemi or a 6.0 LS, you would say, wow, I think this little LT 5.3 will run with those engines, or maybe even outperform them. A big part of the performance of this engine, of course, is the transmission. We are running the 10-speed transmission. But it goes beyond that. We got to start dropping our prejudices against these new modern engines. The LT has now proven itself, in my opinion. It's been out since 2014, so we're talking about almost a decade. I've personally got an LT 6.2 and a Denali, and there's no other engine out there, in my opinion, that can match it for economy and performance. So the question then becomes, which LT do I want? The days of the LS and the Hemi are pretty much over. Not to say they're not viable in the older vehicles, they still are. I still have an L9H in my 09 Rubicon, but let's just face the facts. As we go forward in time here, the government's pushing for EV, electric vehicles. States are pushing more emissions regulations, more jurisdictions are moving over to those regulations. So in order to remain compliant and get the most out of your vehicle, you need to move into the more modern engines. The LT 6.2 is a fabulous engine. I love driving those engines. When you get on the highway and you're going 80 miles an hour, you're going up a hill, you're going down a hill, that engine just doesn't care. So let's try to separate the LT 6.2 from the LT 5.3. The LT 5.3 is 11-to-1 compression, which is low for an LT. Believe it or not. The 6.2s, that's the L86, the LT1 and the others are 11.5-to-1 compression. Guys, those are compression ratios that we ran in the muscle car day with high octane gas, and now we're running it in these grocery getters. So there's one advantage of the LT 5.3 is you can run lower grade fuel. Do I recommend you run lower grade fuel? Not really, because if you put the higher grade fuel in, you get better performance and economy. So if you spend 5 or 10% more in fuel, you're probably going to get 5 or 10% better economy. But the LT 5.3 will react to the lower grade fuels better than the 6.2s. GM has been kind of ambiguous about running the low grade fuels in the 6.2s. They do say you can run regular in the L86. I guess you can. I've done it, but what I notice is a drop in performance. The octane scaler really rolls back, and you see a definite drop in performance and economy. I had a lime green Superbird, it was a 440, and a lime green Hemi Roadrunner. Those were the days where you could drive down the street like a neon light bulb. And it does seem like Chrysler's trying to relive those days again. If you look at like the new Challengers, I saw a Challenger TA on the road, which really surprised me, a new one, because I have an original. They didn't make very many of them. It was one of my favorite cars, and to see that come back where a new generation can enjoy it's pretty cool. Although the original Challenger TA, just like the original Hemi Challengers and Cudas, were pretty crude. Braking systems were crude, suspension was crude, had a lot of horsepower, but didn't really have good chassis dynamics. So my argument is that this LT 5.3 will do what most of you guys want to do. Cruise down the highway in comfort, relatively low stress. And I will say this, when I get up to 6,000 to 7,000 feet, in a heavy JK, and I'm on 37s, I got 1-ton axles with a lot of friction, I got light bars hanging off everywhere, I will see the LT 5.3 drop a couple of gears. It might go from 10th to 9th, even to 8th, but it's not very dramatic. It's a few hundred RPM here and there. But pretty much everywhere else, the LT 5.3 is a confident engine in a JK. The LS 5.3 is a good engine in its own right, but it did prefer the lighter vehicles with less drag, less friction, and all that. The LT 5.3, not so much. So there's 3 LT 5.3s we're working with right now. The first is the L83, which we've done a lot of. The L83 is an active fuel management engine. It has the 4-cylinder mode. It's flex fuel. It has direct injection. It has a dual stage oil pump. It has continuous variable valve timing. Has all the whistles and bells. Great motor. The L83 was readily available new until recently, but now they're getting a little bit scarce. And what became available to us was then the L82. And the L82 is very similar to the L83. Now, this is our experience from doing a bunch of L82s. If you look the L82 up online, you might see some differences. We noticed that the L82 does not have active fuel management or the 4-cylinder mode, which may mean it's a higher performance engine. Whether GM did that because they were short on parts, which I've heard they did on some of the 6.2 LTs, or they did it on purpose to get more performance, I don't know. But what I do know is the L82 can push out close to 400 horsepower on paper, but in reality it feels like it's performing like a 5.7 Hemi, maybe a 6.0 LS. Because it doesn't have the active fuel management 4-cylinder mode, this engine doesn't have the dual stage oil pump, which may make some of you guys happy. It's a simpler engine. It still does have the continuous variable valve timing and the direct injection, so you can think of the L82 as kind of a stripped down L83 that's probably geared a little bit more to performance. Now, do we notice a difference in performance? No, not really. Go rent yourself a Chevy truck. Try to get like a 2020. Try to get an L82. You'll be amazed how powerful that little truck is. Now, when they went to the L84, we've done the L87, which is the big brother to the L84. They did change a lot of things up. They changed the block to put the lifter manifold. Well, the old engines had a lifter manifold oil assembly, which essentially had the active fuel management solenoids inside of it. That's how they deactivated the cylinders. Now they built the solenoids directly into the block. I think they're more reactive or maybe more effective there because they went to a dynamic fuel management. Now, I've heard it both ways. I've had guys with new Denalis and Yukons tell me that the L83 and the L86 seem to outperform the L84 and the L87. But we've done some L87s and they performed awesome in my opinion. So I'm not really sure how it's going to shake out with the L87 versus the L86. We got to give that some time. But the engine is different. The L84 has a different accessory drive than the L83. It has dynamic fuel management for better economy. I will say that when I was driving, and I've driven the L84s in production vehicles, the cylinder deactivation is probably a little bit smoother when it comes in and out. But I'm an old fart and I'm used to mechanical things happening and feeling things. So when I go into 4-cylinder mode, I kind of expect it, but a lot of people don't. And it's productive and counterproductive what I'm finding. Some people feel that the L84 and the L87 may not be as responsive as the L83 and the L86 because you're constantly lacking cylinders. You're not in the 8-cylinder mode as much. So you might be running as a 2, 3, 4-cylinder. The pedal's a little bit soft and you give it a little throttle and then of course it brings cylinders in. But it doesn't feel as zippy, I guess would be a word, as let's say the L83 and the L86. We're going to have to do a few more of these to find out. But what I find is the guys, you know, the hardcore hot rod guys that just want linear power output would probably prefer the L82, L83, L86, LT1 over the L84 and the L87. Due to market dynamics, we're all over the place with the LTs. I don't really care what we put in a JK because all the LTs are awesome. When we first started doing LTs 7 years ago, what was available was the L83 and the L86, mostly with a 6-speed and the 8-speed transmission if we were lucky. Very quickly, the prices dropped as production ramped up. We had auctions, we had GM suppliers selling them off at a really good price. A lot of you guys took advantage of that. But as the early LTs went out of production, just like everything else, the prices started to go up. So we started buying a lot of LT1s, which is probably top of the line. LT1 you can't go wrong with. What are some of the things that you have to consider with an LT1? Well, 1, I would run premium fuel. 2, We do run an external oil cooler on the LT1s because that's how it's set up. We could change the oil pan, but we don't want to because that extra oil cooling helps. So there's some additional cost there. We actually make our own braided steel lions in-house, and then we run a radiant cooler on the left frame rail. GM runs a water to oil cooler on the side of the oil pan. It's quite a large thing hanging off, and it gets in the way of everything, the drive shaft and the differential. But cooling that oil does help on the higher stressed applications. And we can run the same setup on the LED6 if you got like 40-inch tires, and it does help. I mean, you can run on the LED3 if you want, but my experience is the LED3s run pretty darn cool. So as the LED3s and the LED6s became harder and harder to find new, we started to buy the LT1s and the LED2s. And those have been readily available. The LT1 is still readily available, but the price has gone up. The LT1 now is about $1,500, maybe $2,000 more than it was just a couple of years ago. New LED2s are getting hard to find. So what we're starting to see now is the LED4 and the LED7s because they are the most current production. And we're just gonna go with it. The LED4 and the LED7 years ago was very difficult to support. If you guys remember, I told you about GM locking down the bootloaders and the TCMs and the ECMs and getting access to the operating systems. But now all that's pretty much been sorted out. One of the benefits of the LED4 and the LED7, of course, is going to be emissions. Because as we move out of the JK and into the JLs, you need an engine that's going to be the same year or newer than the chassis. And there are some family exceptions. It's basically the same engine from this year to this year, but we're not going to talk about that, and I never recommend you go that route and try to make that argument because emissions inspectors pretty much want to see that the donor engine is the same year or newer than the vehicle you're putting it in. So now you got a 2021 Gladiator. Are you going to throw an LS3 in that thing? Hopefully not, because it's illegal on several levels. So the LD4 and the LD7 are going to have their place. Recently, GM announced that they dropped development of their twin-turbo straight six, similar to the Stellantis Hurricane engine. GM did a bunch of testing and determined that the V8 had better longevity, better bottom end torque, better reliability, and they're staying with their V8 engine, which makes us very happy. They will be releasing a Gen 6 V8. We don't know what it's going to be, but we're looking forward to it. So getting back to the LT 5.3 and is it the engine for you? You're not going to save a ton of money over the LT1 or the LED6 at this time just because of market conditions, and everything has gone up so much. I do want to mention that the LED3s, LED6s are available used in quantity. It's not hard to find an LT in a wrecking yard, low mile LTs. In the old days, we did a lot of used engines, and the LS engines were like giveaways. But now those LS engines are demanding a premium. When we do California bills with LS engines, we have to pay a premium for those engines. And these are engines that just a couple of years ago were selling for half the price we're paying now with less miles. I have an LT 5.3 in my JL, and it's a phenomenal combination. It does have an 8-speed, it doesn't have the 10-speed, but I've had a lot of guys drive it, and most of them are shocked to find out it's a 5.3. They get in, they drive it, they think it's a 6.2. I've even had guys tell me that it'll outperform their 6.4 Hemi JL. How accurate that is, I don't know, but I can tell you that that thing will fry the tires all day long. That vehicle will get 20 plus miles to the gallon. Now, it does have the stock tires on it. It does not all pimped out. But from my experience, the LT 5.3 is one of the best economy motors out there. Giving hard numbers is difficult because JKs are so different. You get one guy in 40s, another guy in 35s, one guy's got light bars hanging off, another guy's aerodynamically clean. You get one guy with a 6-inch lift, another guy that's on the ground. So it's really difficult to tell you what kind of economy you're going to get. But what I find is whatever you're getting with the V6, you're going to get a couple of miles to the gallon better with the V8 if you drive the same speed. Now, with that caveat, if you drive like a maniac, you're going to get less mileage. Never expect to get into a V8 JK or JL and get 25 miles to the gallon. And a lot of guys think that's going to happen. Oh, I'm going to get an LT or I'm going to get a Hemi and I'm going to go from 12 miles to the gallon to 20. It's just not going to happen. Most of the LTs with 37 to 40-inch tires that I drive on the highway will get in the teens, 14, 15, 16. If they have 35-inch tires and they're clean, even 17 and 18 is possible. But whatever you get with any of the other engines, the LT 5.3 is going to be right up there with the rest of them, maybe a little bit better. So I know I've done several videos on the LT 5.3 recently, and it may sound like a promotion, and I guess it is, because the LT 5.3, in my opinion, is an underrated engine. It's powerful. It gets good economy. At this point, I'm going to say it makes a good Expedition engine. A lot of you guys think that the 6.0 LS is the best Expedition engine out there, and it might be. But unfortunately, the 6.0 LS is out of production and getting harder and harder to find. Now, they are around in wrecking yards, that's true. But the 6.0 LS also has some other challenges when it comes to emissions, and it's an iron block. It's a very low-tech engine. So as we move into the future with the JL and the JT and even JKs, the decision's going to come down to basically two choices, in my opinion. Now, this does not include the Hemis or superchargers or anything else. I firmly believe that the LT powertrains are superior to the other powertrains, so that's what I'm going to give you my recommendation on. If you're the guy that wants to cruise on the highway at 75, 80 miles an hour, be able to pass easily, run lower grade fuels, you're not going to be out there like Ricky Racer trying to drag race a Dodge Ram truck or whatever. You want excellent drivability, you want parts availability, low cost parts in pretty much any auto parts store you go to, then the LT 5.3 is for you. If you want that extra measure of performance, then get the 6.2 LT. The 6.2 LT is a little bit over the top for some JKs, especially if they have floppy suspension, they're lifted really high, it can get a little bit squirrely. Do you need all that power? Probably not. But if you want it, then the 6.2 LT will do what you want. The 6.2 LT is going to cost you more. The 6.2 LT is going to require higher grade fuels. The 6.2 LT is going to run a little bit warmer. Amazingly, I don't know how GM did it, but these engines seem to run cooler than the LSs and the Hemis, and I don't know how, but it's the technology and the cooling system that GM uses. So as far as today goes, those are the state-of-the-art powertrains, in my opinion. Choose based on what you want. We're going to hit the mountain with this LT 5.3, and we'll see you shortly.